ESPN's Mike Clay released his annual projections and unit grades for the National Football League teams. I think he got the Washington Commanders graded a little low at the quarterback position, but maybe a little too high at the linebacker position. Overall, where does it put the Commanders in the National Football League? That and more coming up on today's episode of Locked On Commanders.
You are Locked On Commanders, your daily podcast on the Washington Commanders. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This is your daily podcast covering the Washington Commanders, free and available on YouTube or wherever you're listening to this podcast. I'm your host, David Harrison, credential member of the media covering the Washington Commanders for CommanderGameDay.com, a part of Sports Illustrated, here with you every Monday through Friday. And I greatly appreciate you coming through for today's episode every day. Greatly appreciate you coming through every day like you do. On today's episode, we're going to talk about the Washington Commanders' hopes or chances of returning to Richmond, all but gone. We're also going to discuss the difference between the star and Buffalo nickel positions, at least as I see it today. And then we're going to start today's episode talking about Mike Clay's predictions and projections, unit grades from ESPN, and where I think he got them a little bit off, but overall where I think he is fairly close to where the Washington Commanders roster probably should stack early in the offseason program. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers, you get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. So go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started today. Of course, if you want to discuss this episode or anything else Washington Commanders related with me outside of the episode, outside of the program, just head over to joinsubtext.com/lockedoncommanders and become an insider today. From there, you can text me, I can text you. We'll exchange messages, talk about content, analysis, opinions, everything else, and more, all delivered straight to your phone. No downloads, no hashtags, no filters, no apps, none of that. Just text messages from me to you that go beyond the program. Join subtext.com/lockedoncommanders again today to get in on that. ESPN's Mike Clay put out how his 2024 predictions are going to look. Recently put those out. And within them, he predicted the Washington Commanders record. He also graded each unit and stacked them within the rest of the National Football League. And to me, I think while Mike Clay probably has the Washington Commanders overall roster grade fairly close to where they actually should stack up at this point in the offseason, I don't think he got all of the units correctly. So I'm going to tell you where I think that he got the units a little bit wrong. But overall, looking at what Mike Clay predicts for the Washington Commanders, he's got their roster overall ranked at number 29 in the National Football League, just ahead of the Arizona Cardinals, Denver Broncos, and the New York Giants. I think maybe he's got them a little bit low there, but I think overall in the 20s is probably where the Washington Commanders are going to rank. Now, because of that 29th overall ranking, it should be no surprise that Clay also has the Commanders projected to win 5.7 games this season. Of course, you can't win 0.7 games in the National Football League, so it's either going to be 5 or 6, and if you round up, it's probably looking like 6. If I remember correctly, though, my early prediction for the Washington Commanders win-loss record when the NFL schedule came out was about 7 wins, I think, if I remember correctly again. So pretty much right in the same ballpark. Again, I think I'm a little bit higher on the Commanders than Mike Clay is. And Clay has the Washington Commanders favored to only win 3 games this season, which makes sense. 2 against the Giants, 1 against the Cardinals. They don't play the Broncos this year. So that makes sense that there's 3 games that they're favored to win in. Now, his win-loss projection has Washington selecting 5th overall in the 2025 NFL Draft. If that happens, we will have another busy offseason next year. We're going to have a busy offseason next year anyway, to be quite honest with you. But let's look at the unit grades, because that's really where this projection, and this projection is very good. I suggest everybody else, kind of takes time to go through, read it over, look it over. Even if you just look at it through a Washington Commanders lens, that's perfectly fine. But he goes through and he grades each roster. Like I said, the Commanders come in 29th overall, but he breaks it down by unit as well. There's 10 units that he grades in the whole thing, and then he averages that out, and that's how he gets his total roster grade. So therein lies, I don't want to say a flaw, because I don't think it's necessarily a flaw as long as you understand the context of the entire evaluation, right? So, for example, the Kansas City Chiefs don't have the number 1 roster overall grade in the National Football League, but what this grading scale doesn't do is weigh positions, right? So obviously, if you have, say, the best offensive line in the National Football League paired with the best quarterback in the National Football League, but maybe you have a mid-level running back, mid-level receiver, mid-level tight end group, you're probably going to have a pretty solid offense anyway. and your offense is going to probably average out to be around, the upper half of the middle group in the National Football League, but your production is probably going to be like top 10, top 8, given those current circumstances, right? So I don't want to call it a flaw. It's just more of a contextual thing that everybody needs to understand, that when getting the overall grade, there is no weighing position groups as being more important than another. So, the safeties we might consider less important than the edge groups, the defensive line groups, the offensive line groups, and the quarterback group, right? But a 4.0, if your safety group is graded 4.0, it's just as an advantage. It's just as much of an advantage to your overall roster grade as a quarterback being graded at 4.0. So just a little bit of context there, right? So Clay scale, again, it goes from 0 to 4.0. 4.0 is a perfect grade according to Mike Clay scale. Basically goes from, it's color coded, goes from a hard red, which is bad, to white in the middle, which is about average, to a hard green at the very top, depending on where you fall in that scale. And 7 of the 10 position groups graded have Washington with at least a tint of red in them somewhere. Only 3 units have a hint of green, and there's only 1 hard green. That is the linebacker group, which got a hard or a perfect 4 overall score from Mike Clay. So overall, the Commanders grade out at a 1.4 average, which is in the number 1 roster in the National Football League scores out at 2.9. So a 1.5 margin of difference between the 29th ranked and the top ranked roster, according to Mike Clay. When I look at Clay's unit grades, the first discrepancy I find comes with the quarterback position. And this is a little bit hard because how much do you grade Jaden Daniels when he hasn't done anything in the National Football League yet, right? Well, the same question to me should be asked about Chicago Bears quarterback Caleb Williams, Minnesota Vikings quarterback J.J. McCarthy, New England Patriots quarterback Drake May, Denver Broncos quarterback Bo Nix. Those are your quarterbacks, your rookie quarterbacks that are at least anticipated or expected to have the opportunity to start right out the gates. Obviously, Caleb Williams is going to start. There's a presumed competition in Minnesota and New England and Washington right now. It's not so much being talked about as a competition, but Marcus Mariota taking the quote-unquote first-team reps right now during OTAs. And then in Denver, I don't know if it's really being preached as a competition, but you've got Bo Nix, and then you've really got nothing else in Denver. So we assume Denver is going to probably roll Bo Nix out as a starter. Now, so when you look at those guys, right, Washington's quarterback room or quarterback position group gets a 0.9 while Chicago's gets a 1. This is a fatal flaw in our business just overall because rookies have done nothing. So I feel every team in this scale, if it's a 4 scale, you should probably start them at a 2. That's the first flaw, not a major flaw. Now, a couple of other unit grades I don't necessarily agree with come on the defensive side of things. Starting off first and foremost with the edge group. Now, the Commanders grade here for the edge group, according to Mike Clay, is a 0.3, which is darn near at the very, very bottom, right? Almost to the very bottom. And to me, Dorrance Armstrong Jr. was second last year on the Dallas Cowboys unit in sacks. Clelin Ferrell also comes from one of the top graded edge units in San Francisco with the 49ers. Now, I'm not saying that Clelin Ferrell and Dorrance Armstrong leaving makes either of those units, exponentially worse. But if you're ranking these units, and again, the Cowboys last year had a 3.8 grade. The Niners last year had a 2 grade. Then Washington having 2 of those members of those groups, I mean, you should make them at least a 1, right? Now, you also have to consider that the Cowboys linebacker group this year, according to Mike Clay, is graded at a 1, which means that Micah Parsons is being put in the edge group here. So Jamin Davis has potential under the same defensive coaches that helped Micah Parsons realize all his potential should warrant at least a little bit of consideration. So again, I feel like a 1 is not that much to ask when you look at those 3 factors alone. So those 2 changes alone, quarterback and the edge groups, would give Washington an overall 1.6 roster average, which would put them right in the ballpark of number 25 with the Minnesota Vikings. If you actually give the Washington Commanders, say, a 1.5 for Dorrance Armstrong and the Jamin Davis potential with the coaching staff, then potentially you're looking at moving them up to like 22, 23 overall. But I'm also not sure I agree with the perfect 4 that Mike Clay gave the linebacker group. Look, every day, as you know this tremendously, I'm incredibly excited to see Frankie Louvu on the field this year, and I really love the addition of Bobby Wagner. But I'm also willing to admit that my excitement for Frankie Louvu is mostly projection, and Bobby Wagner, as much as I am excited about him, I'm mostly excited about his leadership ability than I am his play. Now, he did make the Pro Bowl in 2023, so that should be mentioned. But Louvu was 22nd in tackles last year, 75th in sacks, 47th in tackles for losses, and 157th in passes defensed among linebackers, according to ESPN, which of course should be the stat pool that Mike Clay is pulling from. Now, I think his tape looks better on tape than his stats look, granted, but I don't know if perfect 4 should fit, especially again, Jamin Davis, if Micah Parsons is in the edge group for Dallas, Jamin Davis should be looked at in the edge group at this point in the offseason for Washington. So that potential would go there, not here. Now, maybe we're splitting hairs a little bit. Overall, I think the Washington Commanders would probably come in with my adjustments, probably come in more like 23rd or 22nd overall. Mike Clay's got him 29th overall. Maybe that's not a big enough a difference to really have, too big of a fit about it. I'm not going to have a fit about it anyway. But those are my thoughts on Mike Clay's grades, Mike Clay's projections. If you want to look at those, if you're a football nerd like I am, which I imagine a lot of you who are watching daily podcasts in the middle of June, early June, probably are football nerds like me. I don't know the exact link, but if you Google Mike Clay 2024 predictions, the PDF link will come up, and I'm pretty sure it's not behind a paywall. So some pretty interesting things in there, Commander specific or entire NFL specific. Just a lot of interesting numbers and data going on in there. Coming up, we're going to talk about the differences, if there are any, between star position and Buffalo nickel positions, what it might mean for Washington Commanders rookies Mike Sainristil and Dominique Hampton. That's coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Commanders is brought to you by FanDuel. It is winner take all time in the NBA and the NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers, you get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more, including parlays, which is some of my favorite, one of my guilty pleasures. In the NBA, the Dallas Mavericks are in Boston to face the Celtics in Game 1 of the NBA Finals on Thursday night, with the Celtics holding a 6.5-point favorite margin of victory to win the game, and they're minus 225 favorites to win the series. The Mavs have a plus 188 line to win the championship. Meanwhile, in the NHL, the state of Florida is celebrating yet another finals appearance as the Florida Panthers punch their ticket and await the winner of the Dallas Stars and Edmonton Oilers series, which could wrap up as early as Sunday night. Of course, the Panthers are favored to win the Stanley Cup with a minus 120 line, while the Oilers are favored to face them in the Stanley Cup Finals. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Thanks again for making Locked On Commanders your first listener, first view today and every day, everydayers. Thanks for coming through. Come back tomorrow. We'll be back with more Washington Commanders content. In the meantime, make sure you're also checking out Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day. The first of its kind, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. Got a couple of questions from insiders stemming from our Logan Paulson interview, which aired on our Friday episode, the episode previous to this one. So if you haven't caught that, always great to talk to Logan on or off camera. So make sure you go back and check that out. We covered a lot of topics in a very short amount of time. But when talking about rookie defensive backs, Mike Sainristil and Dominique Hampton specifically, there are a couple of things that Logan said that caught the attention of some of my insiders. So I figured we throw it here in the episode and talk about it. It's not a mailbag episode, but I thought we would go ahead and throw it in here and talk about it here at the top of the week. Anyway, speaking of Mike Sainristil, Logan Paulson said, quote, Mike Sainristil, I think, did a great job in rookie camp and the early AOTA practices. Just for a young guy to be communicating the way he's communicating, I think is great. Obviously, the star position, that dime position, are both positions that are really predicated on, when the pads come on, how you play and how you perform, end quote. He also said about Dominique Hampton, quote, Dominique Hampton is a guy that sticks out to me quite a bit just in terms of how they're using him, kind of as that dime or star linebacker matching up with tight ends. He's just a big person for a safety, and he can run well. He's a tremendous athlete. When you watch his college film, he's perfect for this Witt defense, for this Dan Quinn defense, and I think that is something really exciting, that he's such a unique body type, long arms, fast, rangy, that can kind of fill that kind of tweener role, end quote. So both things, both quotes, first of all, really good to hear that Logan is very impressed early on with these rookie defensive backs. But what caught the attention of some of my insiders was the use of the word star and star position, dime position. So that we talk about that. What is a star position? So in its most basic form, and again, I'm giving you an outsider, journalist, media, fan covering the game type of thing, right? Because obviously if you're in sports media, you probably grew up a fan of sports. So all those things. I haven't coached in the National Football League, I haven't coached in the NFL. So understand that every team kind of does these things a little bit different. Anyway, so what I'm giving you is a very basic overall vision from my understanding of these terms. So take it with that context, right? So in its most basic form, basically the star is a defensive back who can cover the way that a defensive back should cover, right? But can also support and run defense similar to a linebacker, or just at least, if need be, replace a linebacker. Call it a hybrid tweener, whatever you want. At the end of the day, the star is typically a player who can function from the inside of a defensive formation against the pass and the run, but tends to lean more towards the defensive backside of the spectrum, right? So how can Mike Sainristil and Dominique Hampton both be star players? This is another question that came up in these conversations with my insiders, the way that Logan, because Logan, again, he referred to Mike Sainristil as a potential star player, Dominique Hampton as a potential star as well. So you hear the phrase nickelback, slot corner, those types of things. That's basically what your star is. It just depends on kind of how teams use them, what type of traits that they really value. And again, we're very early in the install here in Washington, but it's really a formational thing for the most part. So if you have a team that likes to use, if you're facing a team, right, that likes to use, say, their tight end detached as a detached receiver alignment, then you might see a guy like Dominique Hampton more preferred because he's a bigger type of guy, so who can work the slot, cover the tight end as a defensive back, but also hold the edge, shed a block against the tight end in case of a run play, right? Whereas against a team that uses a lot of split off tight ends or detached tight ends, a guy like Mike Sainristil, he's going to have a lot of problems in coverage. He's going to have a lot of problems getting off that block, right? So you might not see him used in that slot, quote unquote, star position as much. Now, against teams that use more receivers, than they do detached tight ends, you might see Mike Sainristil, who is smaller in stature but plays very big against the pass and the run. So don't take his size, meaning that he can't stop the run. The dude will put his nose in there, put his face in the fan, as people like to say. So that's kind of the best way for now I can really explain the star position just as an overall view, not having seen Joe Witt Jr.'s full defense at this point in time during these practices. As we start to see it take more shape, we'll get an idea better of how these guys are going to fit. Now, it's in a really interesting position. And to me, it's really interesting because it kind of shows you that evolution of football and how that evolution of football works. Because as teams got more receiver heavy in like the early 2000s, the slot receivers became shorter or became smaller. They became more short area burst type of specialists than they are like downfield speed type specialists. And that led to defenses prioritizing smaller nickel corners, is usually what we call them, slot cornerbacks, whatever, which is still the star, but the star is now getting more pub and use because outside of NFL buildings, now we're starting to realize that there's also this emphasis on understanding how receivers can impact the run game, and offenses are starting to do that a little bit more. So your slot receivers are now getting a little bit bigger at times, a little bit more physical at times. I look at, like, say, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who have Chris Godwin, who's certainly got some size to him. He's going to be their slot receiver once again, and he's a guy who gets really busy and blocking. So when you look at the Washington Commanders defense and how they face up against, say, a guy like Chris Godwin in the slot, Mike Sainristil versus Chris Godwin, or Dominique Hampton versus Chris Godwin, it's going to be an interesting dynamic that they've got to kind of deal with. Now, most of the time, your outside corners, right, are involved in run defense by being a funnel. They protect the far edge. They don't want to let the runner, the ball carrier, get outside of them, because then you basically have nothing but green grass ahead of you, or they're involved in gang tackling. So today's slot, nickel, star, whatever you want to call it, is expected to do at least a little bit of both and do both on his own sometimes as well. But like I said, it kind of leans more towards a defensive back, which is where the question of what's the difference between a star and a Buffalo nickel, where does that come in? And to me, really, it seems like an issue of really mostly semantics at the same, like they're pretty much kind of lined up in the same general area. Again, it's more about usage than it is anything else. But it looks to me like teams who employ a star really look for that DB kind of spectrum, or further on the DB side of the spectrum, while teams that like to use the Buffalo nickel tend to look more towards the linebacker side of things. Now, it's interesting because Mike Sainristil ideally would not be a Buffalo nickel, then he would be a star. But, at the same time, under Jack Del Rio and Ron Rivera, their Buffalo nickels were definitely more safety types that were a little bit bigger for safeties, but still more closer to safeties, yet they still called them Buffalo nickels. Whereas Sean McDermott in Buffalo, his Buffalo nickel is usually a linebacker who also has some safety-like traits to him. And even going back to the Carolina Panthers days when he and Ron Rivera were in Carolina together, the Buffalo nickel in Carolina was linebacker Shaq Thompson, not a safety, although Shaq Thompson was a safety convert from college, but still was a linebacker in the National Football League. So again, Buffalo nickel star in its rawest, most general form, inside defender, inside the box, lined up, not over between the tackles, but kind of in that slot, if you want to call them that. But Buffalo nickels tend to be more linebacker types than DBs. Stars tend to be more DB types than linebackers. But either way, both are expected to be able to cover in the pass game and also defend against the run. So again, very general. Again, every team, like the Los Angeles Rams, have their version of a star that actually they like longer DBs. Guys like Jalen Ramsey have filled that position And then you look at guys like Sean McDermott and Buffalo and how they use the Buffalo nickel versus the star and all that stuff. So certainly some wrinkles in there. During his time in Dallas, Dan Quinn talked about trying to play positionless football, and they used Jaron Kearse in what I would call their star position. He's more of a safety type, but kind of worked in that nickel slot corner at times as well. Deron Blaine also, he was more of an outside cornerback, but trained to play in the slot as well. So if you want more of that coverage, slot receiver or slot defender, then you have a guy like Deron Blaine. Whereas if you want more of a linebacker / safety hybrid, you go with a guy like Jaron Kearse. So coming up, talking about training camp coming up next month, at the end of next month, granted, but still next month. What about Richmond? There are some people holding out hope for Richmond getting back training camp at some point in time. That took a big blow and actually may not be happening ever again, thanks to the move that is coming up. We'll talk about that little bit of news here next on today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Commanders brought to you by Game Time. Game Time makes getting NBA Finals tickets even faster and easier because prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer that it gets to tip-off. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets. The cheapest ticket for Game 1 of the NBA Finals on Thursday night is $582, while the best value, according to GameTime.co or the Game Time app, is $2,371 for a seat in Section 20, row number 1. You got to love those first row seats. If you're in Florida or you're going to be in Florida for Game 1 of the Stanley Cup Finals, you can go see that contest for $362 or get the most value for your dollar with $733 tickets in Section 115 in the Panthers defensive end. And you can get a preview of the action because Game Time shows you the view from your seat before you ever make the purchase. Take the guesswork out of buying NBA Finals tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create your account, use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create your account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Commanders with a little bit of news in case you haven't heard. I know some people out there, and you're not alone, fans. There have been people in the media that I've spoken to also holding out hope that maybe someday the Washington Commanders would return to Richmond, Virginia for part of or all of training camp. Well, the Washington Commanders haven't been to Richmond for 2 years, and they don't have any plans to return anytime soon that I'm aware of. And so the city is making the move to take control of the facility and the fields that were there in Richmond to facilitate training camp, to make it the city's headquarters for their Department of Parks and Recreation. And that is according to a report by Eric Kolinich. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. Eric, sorry if I'm not, of the Richmond Times-Dispatch. Eric reports that the entire space spans 15 acres, houses 2 football fields, and a 2-story building that the team used in the years that they went to Richmond for training camp. The current lease for the property is assigned to the Economic Development Authority. It would transfer to the city if everything goes through as planned, at which time the city reportedly plans to make some changes pending city council approval. Washington held its training camps or parts of training camps there every year from 2013 to 2021, with the exception being 2020's COVID season. The deal between the team and the lease owner wasn't renewed, and so now Richmond Mayor LeVar Stoney wants to use the facility as a government office and a green space for city residents. And my understanding, I don't live in Richmond, but my understanding is a lot of people in Richmond never really liked the deal anyway and probably would prefer a park in that area, especially if the Washington Commanders aren't going to use it. So unlike the RFK Stadium site, which the Washington Commanders are no longer using, this site that the Washington Commanders are no longer using is going to get, it looks like it's going to get resolved and have some sort of use for the people who live in the area sooner rather than later, which that is good news. So even if you were upset or unhappy that Washington will not be, looks like it will not be returning to Richmond for training camp anytime soon, at least something is being done with the property such to sit there. And my understanding is it hasn't just sat there anyway. There's been some uses for it in the meantime, but obviously you'd rather have a more permanent solution for what's going to happen with that space if you can get it. Looks like Richmond is going to get that. I never got the opportunity to cover a training camp at Richmond, so I can't speak personally of experiences there. But I know that some people will be sad to hear that, it looks like the team will not be returning to Richmond anytime. Personally, I think that the team, when you represent not only the nation's capital, but kind of the DMV, you represent multiple demographics of the region. It's as good as possible to try to reach out to as many areas as possible. So, it is what it is. I know Josh Harris also was asked about the requirement to house the new stadium, new practice facility, all that stuff, all in one area. And he said that doesn't necessarily have to happen. Again, he understands the widespread demographic of this organization. So having multiple pieces of the organization in different areas, especially in different states, potentially not necessarily something that Josh Harris is against. But Richmond, at least for now, off the table. Again, never say never. Doesn't mean that there's not some new deal that could be struck up in the future at some point in time for the Commanders to host or hold a training camp in Richmond. But looks like right now that is probably not in the near future plans for the organization. That's going to wrap it up for today's episode. Coming up tomorrow, we'll be back with another look at the Washington Commanders. Probably going to talk about some practice previews. We get our third OTA practice of the offseason on Wednesday. So tomorrow, probably going to be talking about some things that we like to see or expect to see from that practice. In the meantime, you got questions or comments, just throw them down in the YouTube comment section. Insiders, text me directly. If you want to become an insider, go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnCommanders. Don't forget to check out Locked On Sports Today, the first ever 24/7 live streaming sports channel on YouTube. And as always, thank you for making Locked On Commanders your first listener, first view today and every day. Everydayers, thanks for coming through on a regular basis like you do. Until we speak again, if you're out and about, please be safe, be kind, and I'll see you next time for another episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Shortly after we got done recording and before, luckily, I was able to publish the episode, the Washington Commanders revealed or announced that they have released kicker Brandon McManus. Of course, McManus is the central player at the center of now what looks like is going to be multiple lawsuits probably against not only him, but the Jacksonville Jaguars and potentially the NFL as the managing league of course, the Jacksonville Jaguars within that organization. Not a move that was a surprise, not a move that is a surprise, but now the Washington Commanders will turn their attention towards finding a new kicker. Again, next OTA practice open to the media happens on Wednesday, so we assume that there will probably be one, maybe even two additions made as the roster allows for it before that practice, certainly before the mandatory minicamp coming up next week.